Chapter 7 of Master of the Vineyard by Myrtle Reed. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. A letter and a guest. A letter for you, Mother. Alden tossed a violet-scented envelope into the old lady's lap as he spoke and stood there waiting. For me? She exclaimed. Letters for either of them were infrequent. She took it up curiously, scrutinized the address, sniffed at the fragrance the missive carried, noted the postmark, which was that of a town near by, and studied the waxen purple seal stamped with indistinguishable initials. "I haven't the faintest idea whom it's from," she said helplessly. "Why not open it and see?" he suggested, with kindly sarcasm. His assumed carelessness scarcely veiled his own interest in it. "You always were a bright boy, Alden," she laughed. Another woman might have torn it open rudely, but Madame searched through her old mahogany desk until she found a tarnished silver letter opener, thus according due courtesy to her unknown correspondent. Having opened it, she discovered that she could not read the handwriting, which was angular and involved beyond the power of words to indicate. "Here," she said, "your eyes are better than mine." Alden took it readily. "My eyes may be good," he observed after a long pause, "but my detective powers are not. The M's and N's are all alike, and so are most of the other letters. She's an economical person. She makes the same hieroglyphic do duty for both A, G, and a Y." "It's from a woman, then?" "Certainly. Did you ever know a man to sprawl a note all over 2 sheets of paper, with nothing to distinguish the end from the beginning? In the nature of things, you'd expect her to commence at the top of a sheet, and in a careless moment she may have done so. Let me see. Yes, here it is. My dear Mrs. Marsh." "Go on, please," begged Madame, after a silence. "It was just beginning to be interesting." "During my mother's last illness," Alden read, with difficulty, "she told me that if ever I were in trouble I should go to you, that you would stand in her place to me. I write to ask if I may come, for I can no longer see the path ahead of me, and much less do I know the way in which I should go. You surely remember her. She was Louise Lane before her marriage to my father, Edward Archer. Please send me a line or two, telling me I may come, if only for a day. Believe me, no woman ever needed a friendly hand to guide her more than yours unhappily, Edith Archer Lee." "Louise Lane," murmured Madame, reminiscently. "My old schoolmate. I didn't even know that she had a daughter, or that she was dead. How strangely we lose track of one another in this world." "Yes?" said Alden, encouragingly. "Louise was a beautiful girl," continued Madame, half to herself. "She had big brown eyes with long lashes, a thick, creamy skin that some way reminded you of white rose petals, and the most glorious red hair you ever saw. She married an actor, and I heard indirectly that she had gone on the stage, then I lost her entirely." "Yes?" said Alden, again. "Edith Archer Lee," Madame went on. "She must be married. Think of Louise Lane having a daughter old enough to be married. And yet my Virginia would have been 32 now. Dear me, how the time goes by!" The tall clock on the landing chimed 5 deep, musical strokes, the canary hopped restlessly about his gilt cage, and the last light of the sweet spring afternoon, searching the soft shadows of the room, found the crystal ball on the table and made merry with it. "Time is still going by," Alden reminded her. "What are you going to do?" Madame started from her reverie. "Do? Why, she must come, of course." "I don't see why," Alden objected, gloomily. "I don't like strange women." "It is not a question of what we like or don't like, my son," she returned, in gentle reproof. "She is in trouble, and she needs something we can give her." "When people are in trouble they usually want either money or sympathy, or both." "Sometimes they only need advice." "There are lots of places where they can get it. Advice is as free as salvation is said to be." Madame sighed. Then she crossed the room and put her hands upon his shoulders. "Dear, are you going to be cross?" His face softened. "Never to you, if I know it, but why should strange women invade the peace of a man's home? Why should a woman who writes like that come here?" "Don't blame her for her handwriting. She can't help it." "I don't blame her, far from it. On the contrary, I take off my hat to her. A woman who can take a plain pen and plain ink and do such dazzling wonders on plain paper is entitled to sincere respect, if not admiration." Smiling, Madame went to her desk and in a quaint old fashioned script wrote a note to Mrs. Lee. "There," she said as she sealed it. "I've asked her to come to morrow on the 6 o'clock train. I've told her that you will meet her at the station, and that we won't have dinner until 7:30. That will give her time to rest and dress. If you'll take it to the post office now, she'll get it in the morning." Alden shrugged his shoulders good humouredly, kissed his mother, and went out. He wondered how he would recognise the "strange woman" when she arrived on the morrow, though a few people came on the 6 o'clock train, or, for that matter, on any train. "Might write her a little note on my own account," he mused. "Ask her to take off her right shoe and hold it in her left hand, or something of that sort. No, that isn't necessary. I'll bet I could go into a crowd of 1,000 women and pick out the one who wrote that letter." The scent of violets still haunted him, but by the time he had posted his mother's note, he had forgotten all about it and was thinking of Rosemary. Madame, however, was busy with plans for her guest's comfort. She took down her best hand embroidered linen sheets, shaking out the lavender that was laid between the folds, selected her finest towels and dresser covers, ransacked 3 or 4 trunks in the attic for an old picture of Louise Lane, found a frame to fit it in, laid out fresh curtains, had the shining silver candlesticks cleaned again, and opened wide every window of the long unused guest room to give it a night's airing. Downstairs, she searched through the preserve closet for dainties to tempt an unhappy woman's appetite, meanwhile rejoicing with housewifely pride in her well stocked shelves. That evening, while Alden read the paper, she planned a feast for the next night, and mended, with fairy like stitches, the fichu of real lace that she usually wore with her lavender silk gown. "Is it a party?" queried Alden, without looking up from his paper. "Yes. Isn't company a party?" "That depends. You know 3 are said to be a crowd." "Still inhospitable, dear?" "Only mildly so. I contemplate the approaching evil with resignation, if not content. You and I have lived alone so long that we've got ourselves into a rut. Every one we meet may give us something, and receive something from us in return." "I perceive," said Alden, irrelevantly, "that the Lady Mother is going to be dressed in her best when the guest arrives." A pale pink flush mantled the old lady's fair cheeks. At the moment she looked like a faded rose that had somehow preserved its sweetness. "Why not?" she asked. "Why do we always do for strangers what we do not willingly do for our own flesh and blood?" he queried, philosophically. "You love me better than anything else in the world, yet you wouldn't put on that lavender gown twice a year just for me alone. The strange woman may feast her eyes upon it the moment she enters the house. She'll eat from the best china, sleep between embroidered sheets, and, I have no doubt, drink the wine that Father put away the day I was born, to be opened at my wedding." "Not at your wedding, my son, but the day you found the woman you loved." Then, after a long pause, she added, shyly, "Shouldn't it be opened now?" "It'll keep," the young man grunted. "After lying for 30 years among the cobwebs, a few more weeks or months or years, as the case may be, won't hurt it. Besides, I don't expect to have any wedding. I'm merely going to be married. Might as well let the strange woman have it." Alden's father had, as he said, put away on the day he was born all the wine that was then ready to be bottled. The baby girl had been welcomed gladly, especially as she had her mother's eyes, but the day the second Alden Marsh was born, the young father's joy had known no bounds. He had gone at dusk to the pale little mother, and, holding her in his arms, had told her about the wine. "I've put it all away," he had said, "for the boy. He's to open it the day he finds the woman he loves as I love you." The shelf in the storeroom where he had placed it had never been disturbed, though dust and cobwebs lay thickly upon it, and Madame had always prided herself upon her immaculate housekeeping. It grieved her inexpressibly because Alden cared so little about it, and had for it, apparently, no sentiment at all. To her it was sacred, like some rare wine laid aside for communion, but, as she reflected, the boy's father had died before he was much more than a child. "Don't you remember your father at all?" asked Madame, with a sigh. "I can't say that I do, that is, not before he died." The casket and the gloom of mourning had made its own vivid impression upon the child's sensitive mind. One moment stood out quite clearly, but he forbore to say so. It was when his mother, with the tears raining down her face, had lifted him in her arms and bade him look at the man who lay in the casket, oh, so cold and still. "Say good bye to father, dear," she had sobbed. "Is father gone away?" he had asked, in childish terror. Then she had strained him to her heart, crying out: "Just for a little while. Oh, if I could only believe it was just for a little while!" The rest had faded into a mist of sadness that, for a long time, had not even begun to lift. When he found his mother in tears, as he often did after that, he went away quietly, knowing that she longed for "father," who had gone away and never returned. Later, he used to sit on the top step of the big Colonial porch, a fragile little figure, waiting, through the long Summer afternoons, for the father who did not come. Once, when his mother was so absorbed in her grief that she did not hear him come into the room, he had laid a timid, trembling hand upon her knee, saying: "Mother, if you will tell me where father is, I will go and bring him back." But instead of accepting the offer, she had caught him to her breast, sobbing, with a sudden rush of impassioned prayer: "Dear God, no, not that!" Time, as always, had done his merciful healing, which, though slow, is divinely sure. Madame was smiling now, at some old memory that had come mysteriously out of the shadow, leaving all bitterness behind. She had finished mending the lace and had laid it aside. Alden took it up awkwardly and looked at it. "This for the strange woman," he said, teasingly, "and plain black or grey silk for me, though I am fain to believe that you love me best. Why is it?" "Because," she responded, playfully, "you know me and love me, even without fuss and frills. For those who do not know us, we must put our best foot forward, in order to make sure of the attention our real merit deserves." "But doesn't immediately command? Is that it?" "I suppose so." "What must I wear to the train? My dress suit?" "Don't be foolish, son. You'll have plenty of time to dress after you get home." "Shall I drive or walk?" "Take the carriage. She'll be tired. Unhappy women are always tired." "Are they tired because they're unhappy? Or unhappy because they're tired? And do they get unhappier when they get more tired, or do they get more tired when they get unhappier?" "Don't ask me any more conundrums to night. I'm going to bed to get my beauty sleep." "You must have had a great many, judging by the results." Madame smiled as she bent to kiss his rough cheek. "Good night, my dear. Think of some other pleasant things and say them to morrow night to Mrs. Lee." "I'll be blessed if I will," Alden muttered to himself, as his mother lighted a candle and waved her hand prettily in farewell. "If all the distressed daughters of all Mother's old schoolmates are coming here, to cry on her shoulder and flood the whole place with salt water, it's time for me to put up a little tent somewhere and move into it." By the next day, however, he had forgotten his ill humour and was at the station fully 10 minutes before 6 o'clock. As it happened, only one woman was among the passengers who left the train at that point. "Mrs. Lee?" he asked, taking her suit case from her. "Yes. Mr. Marsh?" "Yes. This way, please." "How did you know me?" she inquired as she took her place in the worn coupé that had been in the Marsh stables for almost 20 years. "By your handwriting," he laughed, closing the door. A smile hovered for a moment around the corners of her mouth, then disappeared. "Then, too," he went on, "as you were the only woman who got off the train, and we were expecting you, I took the liberty of speaking to you." "Did you ask the man to have my trunk sent up?" "Trunk?" echoed Alden, helplessly. "Why, no. Was there a trunk?" She laughed. a little low rippling laugh that had in it an undertone of sadness. There was a peculiar throaty quality in her voice, like a muted violin or 'cello. "Don't be so frightened, please, for I'm not going to stay long, really. I'm merely the sort of woman who can't stay over night anywhere without a lot of baggage." "It wasn't that," he murmured. "Yes, it was. You don't need to tell me polite fibs, you know. How far are we from the house?" "Not as far," returned Alden, rallying all his forces for one supreme effort of gallantry, "as I wish we were." She laughed again, began to speak, then relapsed into silence. Furtively, in the gathering shadow, he studied her face. She was pale and cold, the delicate lines of her profile conveyed a certain aloofness of spirit, and her mouth drooped at the corners. Her hat and veil covered her hair, but she had brown eyes with long lashes. Very long lashes, Alden noted, having looked at them a second time to make sure. The silence became awkward, but he could think of nothing to say. She had turned her face away from him and was looking out of the window. "How lovely the country is," she said, pensively. "I wish sometimes I never had to step on a pavement again." "Do you have to?" he asked. "Yes, for I'm over civilized. Like the god in Greek mythology, I need the touch of earth occasionally to renew my strength, but a very brief contact is all sufficient. I am a child of the city, brought up on smoke and noise." "You don't look it," he said, chiefly because he could think of nothing else to say. Madame herself opened the door for them, with the old fashioned hospitality which has an indefinable charm of its own. "How do you do, my dear?" she said, taking the hand the younger woman offered her. In the instant of feminine appraisement, she had noted the perfectly tailored black gown, the immaculate shirt waist and linen collar, and the discerning taste that forbade plumes. The fresh, cool odour of violets persisted all the way upstairs, as Madame chattered along sociably, eager to put the guest at her ease. Below, they heard Alden giving orders about the trunk, and Mrs. Lee smiled, a little, wan ghost of a smile that Madame misunderstood. "You don't need to dress if you're tired," she suggested, kindly, "though we always do. Come down just as you are." Mrs. Lee turned to the dainty little woman who stood before her, arrayed in shining lavender silk. The real lace fichu was fastened at the waist with an amethyst pin, and at her throat she wore a string of silver beads. Her white hair was beautifully dressed, and somewhere, among the smooth coils and fluffy softness, one caught the gleam of a filigree silver comb. "Not dress?" she said. "Indeed I shall, as soon as my trunk comes. That is," she added, hastily, "if there's anyone to hook me up." "There is," Madame assured her. "I'll leave you now to rest. We dine at 7:30." The sweetness of the lavender scented room brought balm to Edith Lee's tired soul. "How lovely she is," she said to herself, as she noted the many thoughtful provisions for her comfort, "and how good it is to be here." A silver framed photograph stood on her dressing table, and she picked it up, wondering who it might be. The hair and gown were old fashioned, and the face seemed old fashioned also, but, in a moment, she had recognized her mother. Tenderness for the dead and the living filled her heart. How dear it was of Madame to have placed it there, this little young mother, just budding into womanhood. It had been taken long before she had known of Edith, or had more than dreamed of love. The arrival of the trunk compelled her to brush away a few foolish tears. She did not stop to unpack, but only took out the dinner gown that lay on top. Promptly at 7:30 she went down into the living room, where Alden and his mother were waiting to receive her. Madame smiled with pure delight at the vision that greeted her, but the young man forgot his manners and stared like the veriest schoolboy at the tall, stately figure, clad in shimmering pale green satin that rippled about her feet as she walked, brought out a bit of colour in her cheek and lips, deepened the brown of her eyes, and, like the stalk and leaves of a tiger lily, faded into utter insignificance before the burnished masses of her red gold hair. CHapter 8 of Master of the Vineyard, by Myrtle Reed. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. whom God hath joined. Breakfast had been cleared away and Alden, with evident regret, had gone to school. Madame gave her orders for the day, attended to a bit of dusting which she would trust no one else to do, gathered up the weekly mending and came into the living room, where the guests sat, idly, robed in a gorgeous negligee of sea green crepe which was fully as becoming as her dinner gown had been the night before. Madame had observed that Mrs. Lee was one of the rarely fortunate women who look as well in the morning as in the evening. Last night, in the glow of the pink shaded candles, she had been beautiful, and this morning she was no less lovely, though she sat in direct sunlight that made a halo of her hair. The thick, creamy skin, a direct legacy from Louise Lane, needed neither powder nor rouge, and the scarlet lips asked for no touch of carmine. But the big brown eyes were wistful beyond words, the dark hollows beneath spoke of sleepless nights, and the corners of the sweet mouth drooped continually, in spite of valiant efforts to smile. "I think I should have known you anywhere," Madame began. "You look so much like your mother." "Thank you. It was dear of you to put her picture on my dressing table. It seemed like a welcome from her." Madame asked a few questions about her old schoolmate, receiving monosyllabic answers, then waited. The silence was not awkward, but of that intimate sort which, with women, precedes confidences. "I suppose you wonder why I came?" the younger woman said, after a long pause. "No," Madame replied, gently, "for you told me in your note that you were troubled and thought I could help you." "I don't know why I should have thought of you especially, though I have never forgotten what Mother told me about coming to you if I were in trouble, but 2 or 3 days ago, it came to me all at once that I was wandering in a maze of darkness and that you could show me the way out." "I hope I may," the old lady murmured. "I shall be very glad to, if I can. What has gone wrong?" "Everything," she returned, her brown eyes filling with mist. "Of course it's my husband. It always is, isn't it?" "I don't know why it should be. Is he cruel to you?" "No, that is, he doesn't beat me or anything of that sort. He isn't coarse. But there's a refined sort of cruelty that hurts worse. I couldn't bear it any longer and so I came away." "Was he willing for you to come?" "I didn't ask him. I just came." Madame's glasses dropped from her aristocratic nose in astonishment. "Why, my dear Mrs. Lee, how could you?" "Edith, please, if you will," she answered, wiping her eyes. Then she laughed bitterly. "Don't be kind to me, for I'm not used to it and it weakens my armour of self defence. Tell me I'm horrid and have done with it." "Poor child!" breathed Madame. "Poor, dear child!" For a few moments the young woman bit her lips, keeping back the tears by evident effort. Then, having gained her self control, she went on. "I'm 28 now," she said. "I remember Mother used to say she always had her suspicions of a woman who was willing to tell the truth about her age." "Sounds just like her," commented Madame, taking up a dainty lavender silk stocking that had "run down" from the hem. "I've been married 6 years, but it seems like 20. Almost from the first there has been friction between us, but nobody knows it, except you, unless he's told his friends, and I don't think he'd do that. We've both had a preference for doing the family laundry work on the premises." "What?" queried Madame, missing the allusion. "Not washing our soiled linen in public," Edith explained. "While I live with my husband as his wife, we stand together before the world as far as it is in my power to manage it. I do not intentionally criticize him to anyone, nor permit anyone to criticize him. I endeavour to look ahead, protect him against his own weakness or folly, and, as far as a woman's tact and thought may do, shield him from the consequences of his own mistakes. I lie for him whenever necessary, or even advisable. I have tried to be, for 6 years, shelter, strength, comfort, courage. And," she concluded bitterly, "I've failed." "How so?" "We live in the same house, but alien and apart. We talk at the table as two strangers might in a crowded restaurant or hotel, that is, when he's there. I dare not ask people to dinner, for I never know whether he's coming or not. He might promise faithfully to come and then appear at midnight, without apology or excuse. He supports you?" suggested Madame, glancing at the sea green crape. "Yes, of course." "That is, the question of money hasn't arisen between us, one way or another. I have no children, father and mother left me plenty of money, and I don't mind using it in any way that seems advisable. In fact, if I had to, I'd rather pay the household bills than beg for money, as many a wife is compelled to do, or, for that matter, even ask for it. It isn't as if I had to earn it myself, you know. If I had to, I'd probably feel differently about it, but as it is, money doesn't matter between us at all. Friends of mine," she resumed, "have to resort to all sorts of subterfuges. I know women who bribe the tradespeople to make their bills larger than they should be and give them the difference in cash. I know men who seem to think they do their wives a favour by paying for the food they themselves eat and by paying their own laundry bills. Then, every once in a while, I see in some magazine an article written by a man who wonders why women prefer to work in shops and factories rather than to marry. It must be better to get a pay envelope every Saturday night without question or comment, than it is to humiliate your immortal soul to the dust it arose from, begging a man for money to pay for the dinner he ate last night, or for the price of a new veil to cover up your last year's hat. All this," said Madame, threading her needle again, "is new to me. I live so out of the world that I know very little of what is going on outside. Happy woman! Perhaps I should be happy also, since this particular phase of the problem doesn't concern me. Money may not be your best friend, but it's the quickest to act, and seems to be favourably recognized in more places than most friends are. For the size of it, a cheque book is about the greatest convenience I know of." The brown eyes were cold now, and their soft lights had become a glitter. The scarlet mouth was no longer sweet and womanly, but set into a hard, tight line. Colour burned in her cheeks, not a delicate flush, but the crimson of defiance, of daring. She was, as she sat there, a living challenge to fate. "Is he happy?" queried Madame. "I suppose so. His ideal of a wife seems to be one who shall arrange and order his house, look after his clothing, provide for his material comfort, be there when he comes, sit at the head of his table, dressed in her best when he deigns to honour dinner with his presence, ask no questions as to his comings or goings, keep still if he prefers to read either the morning or evening paper while he eats, and to refrain from annoying him by being ill, or, at least, by speaking of illness. I saw once a huge cocoa husk doormat with the word 'Welcome' on it in big red letters. I've been sorry ever since that I didn't buy it, for it typified me so precisely. It would be nice, wouldn't it, to have at your front door something that exactly indicated the person inside, like the overture to a Wagner opera, using all the themes and motifs that were coming. That's what I've been for 6 years, but if a worm will turn, why not a wife?" "If you'll excuse me for saying so," Madame answered in a tone of quiet rebuke, "I don't think it was quite right to come away without letting him know you were coming." "Why not?" "He'll wonder where you are." "I've had plenty of opportunity to wonder where he was." "But what will he think when he finds out you have gone?" "He may not have noticed it. I have competent servants and they'll look after him as well or better than I do. If I had left a wax figure in the library in one of my gowns, with its back to the door and its head bent over a book, I could have been well on my way to China before I was missed, or rather that I was among those not present. If he has found it out, it has been by the application of the same inductive methods by which I discover that he's not coming home to dinner." "Do you love him?" In the answer to that question lay Madame's solution of all difficulties past and to come. To her, it was the divine reagent of all life's complicated chemistry, the swift turning of the prism, with ragged edges breaking the light into the colours of the spectrum, to a point where refraction was impossible. "I did," Edith sighed. "But marriage is a great strain upon love." The silvery cadence of Madame's laughter rang through the house and echoed along the corridor. As though in answer, the clock struck 10, the canary sang happily, and a rival melody came from the kitchen, in cracked soprano, mercifully muted by distance and 2 closed doors. "See what you've started," Edith said. "It's like the poem, where the magic kiss woke the Princess, and set all the clocks to going and the little dogs to barking outside. Don't let me talk you to death. I've been chattering for considerably over an hour, and very selfishly, of my own affairs, to the exclusion of everything else." "But your affairs interest me extremely. I wish I knew of some way to help you." "In the last analysis, of course, it comes to this. Either go on and make the best of it, or quit." "Not divorce," breathed Madame. Her violet eyes were wide with horror. "No," Edith answered shortly, "not divorce. Separation possibly, but not divorce, which is only a legal form permitting one to marry again. Personally, I feel bound by the solemn oath I took at the altar, 'Until death do us part,' and, forsaking all others, keep thee only unto me so long as we both shall live. All the laws in the country couldn't make me feel right with my own conscience if I violated that oath." "If the marriage service were changed," Madame said, nodding her approval, "it might be justified. If one said at the altar, 'Until death or divorce do us part,' or 'Until I see someone else I like better,' there'd be reason for it, but as it is, there isn't. And again it says, 'Those whom God hath joined let no man put asunder.'" "Those whom God hath joined no man can put asunder," Edith retorted. "But did God do it? It doesn't seem right to blame Him for all the pitiful mistakes that masquerade as marriage. Mother used to say," she resumed after a little, "that when you're more miserable without a man than you think you ever could be with him, it's time to marry him, and when you're more miserable with him than you think you ever could be without him, it's time to quit." "And," suggested Madame, "in which class do you belong?" "Both, I think that is, I'm miserable enough to belong to both. I'm unhappy when he's with me and wretched when he isn't. As he mostly isn't, I'm more wretched than unhappy. In the small circle in which I move I'm considered a very fortunate woman. Women who are compelled to be mendicants and who do not know that I have a private income envy me my gowns and hats, my ability to ask a friend or two to luncheon if I choose, and the unfailing comfort of a taxicab if I'm caught in the rain. They think, if they had my gowns and my grooming, that they could win and keep love, which seems to me about all a woman wants. But these things are, in reality, as useless as painting the house when the thermometer is below zero and you need a fire inside to warm your hands by. I have imported gowns and real lace and furs and jewels, and all the grooming I'm willing to take, but my soul is frozen and starved. My house," she went on, "isn't a mansion, but it has all the comforts anyone could reasonably require. As far as my taste can discover, it's artistic and even unusual. The dinner my cook sends up every night is as good, or better, than any first-class hotel can serve, though it may not be quite so elaborate. I myself am not so bad to look at, I am well dressed and never untidy. I am disgustingly well, which is fortunate, for most men hate a sick woman. If I have a headache, I don't speak of it. I neither nag nor fret nor scold, and I even have a few parlour tricks which other people consider attractive. For 6 years I have given generously and from a full heart everything he has seemed to require of me. I've striven in every way to please him, adapting myself to his tastes. I've even been the sort of woman men call a good fellow, admiringly among women and contemptuously among themselves. And in return I have nothing, not even the fairy gold that changes to withered leaves when you take it into the sunshine." "You seem to have a good deal, dear. Youth and health and strength and sufficient income. How many women would be glad to have what you have?" "I want love," cried Edith, piteously. "I want someone to care for me, to be proud of me for what I am and the little things I can do. If I painted a hideous dog on a helpless china plate, I'd want someone to think it was pretty. If I cooked a mess in the chafing dish or on the stove, I'd want someone to think it was good, just because I did it. If I embroidered a red rose on a pink satin sofa cushion, or painted a winter scene on a wooden snow shovel and hung it up in the parlour, I'd want someone to think it was beautiful. If I wrote a limerick, I'd want someone to think it was clever. I want appreciation, consideration, sympathy, affection. I'm starving for love. I'm dying for it, and I'd go across the desert on my knees for the man who could give it to me." "Perhaps he cares," said Madame consolingly, "and doesn't show it." "You can tell by the way a man kisses you whether he cares or not. If he doesn't kiss you at all, he doesn't care and doesn't even mind your knowing it. If he kisses you dutifully, without a trace of feeling and by preference, on your cheek or neck, he doesn't care but thinks he ought to, and hopes you won't find out that he doesn't. But if he cares how it thrills you if he cares!" Madame's violet eyes grew dim. "I know," she said brokenly, "for I had it all once, long ago. People used to say that marriage changes love, but with us, it only grew and strengthened. The beginning was no more the fulness of love than an acorn is the oak tree which springs from it. We had our trials, our differences, and our various difficulties, but they meant nothing. I've had almost all the experiences of life," she continued, clearing her throat. "The endless cycle of birth and death has passed on its way through me. I've known poverty, defeat, humiliation, doubt, grief, discouragement, despair. I've had illness and death. I've borne children only to lose them again. I've worked hard, and many times I've had to work alone, but I've had love, though all I have left of it is a sunken grave." "And I," answered Edith, "have had everything else but love. Believe me, I'd take all you've had, even the grave, if I could have it once." "It may come," said Madame hopefully. Edith shook her head. "That's what I'm afraid of." "How so? Why be afraid?" "You see," she explained, "I'm young yet, and I'm not so desperately unattractive as my matrimonial experiences might lead one to believe. I haven't known there was another man on earth except my husband, but his persistent neglect has made me open my eyes a little, and I begin to see others on a far horizon. Red blood has a way of answering to red blood, whether there are barriers between or not, and if I loved another man, and he were unscrupulous—" "But," objected the older woman, "you couldn't love an unscrupulous man." "Couldn't I? My dear, when I see the pitiful specimens of manhood that women love, the things they give, the sacrifices they make, the neglect and desertions they suffer from, the countless humiliations they strive to bear proudly, I wonder that any one of us dares to look in the mirror. It's the eternal woman hunger for love that makes us what we are, compels us to endure what we do, and keeps us all doormats with 'Welcome' printed on us in red letters. Eagerly trustful, we keep on buying tickets to the circus, and never discover until we're old and grey that it's always exactly the same entertainment, and we're admitted to it, each time, by a different door. Sometimes we see the caged wild animals first, and again, we arrive at the pink lemonade stand. Or up at the other end, where the trapezes are, or in the middle, opposite the tank. Sometimes the band plays and sometimes it doesn't, but all you need in order to be thoroughly disillusioned is to stay to the concert, which bears about the same relation to the circus that marriage does to your anticipations." "Are you afraid," laughed Madame, "that you'll buy another ticket?" "No, but I'll find it, or somebody will give me a pass. I'm too young to stay to the concert, and there's more of life coming to me still. I only hope and pray that I'll manage to keep my head and not make the fatal, heart-breaking mistake of the women who go over the precipice, waving defiance at the social law that bids them stay with the herd." "Your metaphors are mixed," Madame commented. "Concerts and circuses, and herds, and precipices and doormats. I feel as though you had presented me with a jigsaw puzzle." "So I have. Is my life anything more than that? I don't even know that all the pieces are there. If they would only print the picture on the cover of the box, or tell us how many pieces there are, and give us more than one or two at a time, and eternity to solve it in, we'd stand some chance, perhaps." "More mixed metaphors," Madame said, rolling up the mended stockings. A maid came into the dining room and began to set the table for luncheon. Edith rose from her chair and came to Madame. The dark hollows under her eyes were evident now, and all the youth was gone from her face and figure. "Well," she said in a low tone, "what am I to do?" It was some little time before Madame answered. "I do not know. These modern times are too confused for me. The old way would have been to wait, to do the best one could, and trust God to make it right in His own good time." Edith shook her head. "I've waited, and I've done the best I could, and I've tried to trust. No one can solve a problem for another, but I think, when it's time to act, one knows what to do, and the way is clearly open for one to do it. Don't you feel better for having come here and talked to me?" "Yes, indeed," said the young woman gratefully. "So much was right, I'm sure of that. The train had scarcely started before I felt more at peace than I had for years." "Then, dear, won't you stay with me until you know just what to do?" Edith looked long and earnestly into the sweet old face. "Do you mean it? It may be a long time." "I mean it, no matter how long it is." Quick tears sprang to the brown eyes, and Edith brushed them aside, half ashamed. "It means more trunks," she said, "and your son." "We'll be delighted to have you with us," Madame concluded. "Are you sure?" "Absolutely." Madame was not at all sure, but she told her lie prettily. "Then," said Edith, with a smile, "I'll stay." CHapter 9 of A Master of the Vineyard by Myrtle Reed. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. A spring day. With the tact that seems the birthright of the gifted few, Mrs. Lee adjusted herself to the ways of the Marsh household. Some commotion had been caused by the arrival of 4 more trunks, of different shapes and sizes, but after they had been unpacked and stored, things went on smoothly. Alden's idea of a trunk had hitherto been very simple. To him, it was only a substantial box, variation in size and in exterior finish being the only possible diversions from the original type. When it fell to his lot, on a Saturday morning, to superintend the removal of Mrs. Lee's empty trunks to the attic, he discovered the existence of hat trunks, dresser trunks, and wardrobe trunks, cannily constructed with huge warts on all sides, but the one the trunk was meant to stand upon. "Why so scornful?" a sweet voice asked at his elbow. "I'm not scornful," he returned. "I'm merely interested." "You're fortunate," she smiled, "to be so easily interested." "We're out of the world here, you know, and unfamiliar varieties of the trunk species make me feel much as Crusoe did when he came upon a human footprint in the sand." "I wonder," mused Mrs. Lee, "how he really did feel. It must have been dramatic beyond all words." She sat down on the window seat in the hall and leaned back against the casement of the open window. The warm Spring wind, laden with the sweet scent of growing things, played caressingly about her neck and carried to Alden a subtle fragrance of another sort. Her turquoise blue silk kimono, delicately embroidered in gold, was open at the throat and fastened at the waist with a heavy golden cord. Below it, opened over a white petticoat, was a mass of filmy lace ruffles. Her tiny feet peeped out beneath the lace, clad in pale blue silk stockings and fascinating Chinese slippers that turned up at the toes. From above came discordant rumblings and eloquent but smothered remarks on the general subject of trunks. Mrs. Lee laughed. "They're trying to make the wardrobe trunk stand up on the wrong end, and it won't." "How do you know that's it?" "Because I've heard the same noises and the same general trend of conversation all the way from the Atlantic to the Pacific and back again. The farther west you go, the more accomplished the men are in the art of profanity." "Is it an art? I thought it came naturally." "It does, to some, but you have no idea what study and constant practice can do in developing a natural gift." The sunlight illumined her hair into a mass of spun gold that sparkled and gleamed and shone. It made golden lights in her brown eyes, caressed the ivory softness of her skin, and deepened the scarlet of her lips. "Listen," she said. "Isn't it awful?" "No," returned Alden, "it isn't. In fact, I don't know of any sound I'd rather hear than your trunks being put into our attic." A faint suggestion of a dimple appeared at the corner of her mouth, then vanished. "Well done," she said. "You have atoned nobly for your dismay the night I came, when you found I'd brought a trunk." "I wish you wouldn't," he replied awkwardly. "It wasn't that." "Such a small trunk," she went on, mercilessly. "Just a plain little steamer trunk that you can put under a bed. The kind you can ask a cabman to take down to the cab for you. A little trunk that a woman can almost carry herself. Only room for one gown, one hat, and a few toilet articles." The golden lights in her eyes were dancing and her hair shimmered in the sun. Alden sat down at the farthest end of the window seat and looked out upon the vineyard, faintly green now with the new leaves. The two men descended from the attic and went down the back stairs. "How did Robinson Crusoe feel when he saw the footprint?" he asked, determined to get away from the unlucky subject of trunks. "I don't know," Edith answered, "for I wasn't there. He must have been surprised and frightened and pleased all at once. How interesting it must be to have something happen to you that never happened to anybody before." "But it's all happened before," he objected. "Is there anything new under the sun?" "It's been new at one time or another. We're always too late, that's all. Somebody ate the first oyster, and somebody went to sleep first, and somebody wore the first false hair. No," she continued, with a rose pink flush mantling her face, "I don't. If I did, I wouldn't mind saying so, but Nature gave me quantities of it, so why should I borrow more? Besides, I don't believe there is any more like it, so I couldn't, anyway." "No," he returned, thoughtfully, "I don't believe there is any more like it, either. Your wish to be first in something is surely gratified, for there never was such hair as yours and never will be again." "Mother's was like it." He shook his head. "No, it wasn't. I never saw your mother, but I know better than that." "Ask your mother. There she is now." Madame appeared at the head of the stairs, on the way to her room to dress for luncheon. She paused to smile at the two who sat on the window seat, then would have gone straight on had not Edith called to her. "Mrs. Marsh, isn't my hair exactly like my mother's?" Madame came to her, turned the shining head a little more toward the sun, and patted the fluffiness caressingly. "No," she said, "though your mother had glorious hair, it was nothing like this. Hers was auburn and smooth, yours is reddish gold, almost copper coloured, and fluffy. Besides, you must have nearly twice as much of it." "There," said Alden, "I told you so." "But," persisted Edith, "if it's really copper coloured, it's common. Look at the lady on the copper cent, for instance." "The lady on the copper cent," returned Alden, "is a gentleman who wears feathers." "But under his feathers he has hair the colour of this." "He may not have any hair at all." They both laughed, and Madame smiled, though she did not quite understand what they were talking about. She was still smiling when she reached her own room, for she found it very pleasant to have Edith there, and was delighted to have Alden come to a realising sense of his duties as host. He had, indeed, conducted himself admirably ever since Mrs. Lee's arrival, though he had been very quiet and reserved at first. With some trepidation she had told him that she had invited the guest to remain indefinitely, tactfully choosing a moment after an unusually good dinner, when they chanced to be alone. Alden had taken it calmly, betraying no outward sign of any sort of emotion. "What's the matter with her?" he had asked, curiously. "What's she in trouble about?" "If she wants you to know, my son, she will tell you herself," Madame had replied, in a tone of gentle rebuke. "I have no right to violate her confidence." He shrugged his shoulders good humouredly. "You don't need to squelch me like that, Mother. I don't know that I care, particularly. I was merely making conversation." "Refined conversation is not made of impertinences," Madame suggested. The words were harsh, but the tone was kind. "Don't stab me with epigrams, please, for I don't believe I deserve it." Madame recalled every word they had said as she took down her afternoon gown of black silk, and began to sew frills of real lace in the neck and sleeves. She was glad he had been pleasant about it, for it seemed much more like living, someway, to have another woman in the house. If Virginia had lived, she too had brown eyes, but her hair was brown also. She would have been 4 years older than Edith was now, and undoubtedly married. All Madame's feminine ancestors for generations back had been married. The only spinster in the family, so far as Madame knew, had remained true to the memory of a dead lover. Some women are born to be married, some achieve marriage, and others have marriage thrust upon them, Madame said to herself, unconsciously paraphrasing an old saying. Virginia would have been meant for it too, and by now there would have been children in the old house, pattering back and forth upon the stairs, lisping words that meant no more than the bubbling of a fountain, and stretching up tiny hands that looked like crumpled rose petals, pleading to be taken up and loved. These dream children tugged strangely at the old lady's heartstrings in her moments of reverie. Even yet, after Rosemary came, but they would not be like her own flesh and blood, as a daughter's children always are. Poor Rosemary! How miserable she was at home, and how little she would need to make her happy. To think that she dared not tell her grandmother and aunt that she was engaged to Alden! Madame's cheeks grew warm with resentment in the girl's behalf. Motherless, friendless, alone, with life's great cup of wonder in her rough, red hands. A tap at the door made her start. "Come in," she called. It was Edith, trig and tailor-made in dark green, with a crisp white linen shirtwaist, an immaculate collar, and a dashing green tie. "Mr. Marsh has invited me to go for a drive after luncheon," she said, "and he asked me to come and see if you weren't almost ready. May I do your hair for you?" Madame submitted, not because she cared to have her hair done, but because she liked to be "fussed over," as she put it. There was something very pleasant in the touch of Edith's cool, soft hands. "You're not going to change the way I do it, are you?" she asked, a little anxiously. "No, indeed. I wouldn't change it for anything. It suits you just as it is." "I'm glad you think so, for I've always worn it like this. Alden wouldn't know me if I became fashionable." "He doesn't look a bit like you," said Edith, irrelevantly. "No, but he's the living image of his father, and I'm very glad. It keeps me from missing him too much." Madame's voice broke a little on the last words. "It must be lovely to be missed," said Edith, quickly. "Now Dear, haven't you told him yet?" "He's probably discovered it by this time. Still, I don't know. I've only been away a week." "It isn't right," said Madame, decidedly. "You must let him know where you are." "Why? I never know where he is." "That doesn't make any difference. 2 wrongs never make one perfect right. If you do your part, things will be only half wrong, instead of entirely so." "I'll do whatever you think best," said Edith, humbly. "I came to you because I could think for myself no longer. I'll write him a note before luncheon, if you say so, and post it this afternoon." "I do say so." Therefore luncheon waited for a few moments, to Alden's secret impatience, until Edith came down with her note. She offered it to Madame doubtfully. "Want to see it?" "No, dear, I'll trust you." She sealed it with shamefaced gladness that Madame had not availed herself of the opportunity. She was quite sure that her counsellor would not approve of the few formal lines which were all she had been able to make herself write. After luncheon, when Alden assisted her into Madame's decrepit phaeton, and urged the superannuated horse into a wildly exciting pace of 3 miles an hour, she asked to be driven to the post office. "Thank you," said Alden, "for alluding to it as a drive. It's more like a walk." "It isn't exactly like going out in a touring car," she admitted, "but it's very pleasant, nevertheless. It gives you time to look at the scenery." "Also to photograph it if you should so desire. You don't even need to limit yourself to snapshots. A time exposure is altogether possible." When they reached the post office, Alden took her note and went through the formality of tying the horse. He glanced at the superscription, not because he was interested in her unknown correspondent, but because the handwriting claimed his attention. Through the delicate, angular tracery he made out the address: Mr. William G. Lee. The street and number were beyond his skill in the brief time he had had at his command. "So," he said when he came back, "you're Mrs. William G. I trust you don't call him William." "No. He's the sort of William who is always known as Billy." "Good. That speaks well for him." Alden began to wonder, as he alternately coaxed and threatened the horse toward the river road, what manner of man she had married. Someone, undoubtedly, with the face and figure of Apollo, the courtesy of Chesterfield, and the character of a saint. "It was good of him," he said, gratefully, "to let you come to us." Edith bit her lips and turned her face away. "I was glad to come," she answered, after a pause. For a moment she trembled upon the verge of a confidence, then summoned all her conversational powers to the rescue. She began with the natural beauty of the country through which they were driving, observed that the roads were better adapted to a horse than to an automobile, noted the pleasant situation of the Marsh house on the river shore, veered for a moment to the subject of good roads in France, came back to the blue reflection of the sky upon the smooth surface of the river, admired the situation of the Vineyard, said that Madame's phaeton was extremely comfortable, and concluded by asking if it wasn't almost time for apple blossoms. "All of which means," said Alden, quietly, "that you're unhappily married." "How do you know?" demanded Edith, crimson with surprise and mortification. "Did your mother tell you?" "No, she didn't. Most decidedly she didn't. I just know, that's all." "How? Do I betray myself so completely as that?" He answered her question by another. "How did you know, the night you came, that I was surprised and not altogether pleased by the fact that you had brought a trunk? Were my manners as bad as all that?" "Why, no. I just knew." "And how did you know this morning, when we were sitting on the window seat, that I was wondering whether or not you wore false hair?" "Why, I just knew." "That's it, exactly." "How long have you known?" "Ask me something easier than that," he laughed, endeavouring to relieve a situation that threatened to become awkward. Following his lead, she began to ask questions about the Vineyard and, when he told her he feared he knew very little about his work, suggested that he should read up on vine culture and make it the best paying vineyard in the State. "Has Mother been talking to you?" he demanded, turning to her quickly. "About the Vineyard? No. But if it's your work, why not do it better than anybody else does it?" Alden looked at her long and earnestly. The golden lights of her eyes were thrown into shadow now, for it was afternoon and they were driving east. Her answering smile gave him confidence, courage. Moreover, it challenged him in some subtle way he could not analyze. It dared him, as it were, to make the best of the Vineyard and himself. "Thank you," he said at length. "I believe I will." The divine moment passed, and for the remainder of the drive they talked commonplaces. But the fresh air from the hills, the freedom of the wind-swept spaces, the steady aspiration of everything that lived, brought the colour to Edith's cheeks, the sparkle to her eyes, and ministered secretly to her soul. When she went in, she looked happier than she had since she came. Madame saw it and was glad, but wisely said nothing. She came down at dinner time in a black lace gown trimmed with spangles that glittered when she moved. It was cut away slightly from the rounded, ivory throat, and the white arms were bare to the elbow. The upper parts of the sleeves were made of black velvet ribbon, latticed into small, diamond-shaped openings through which the satin texture of the skin showed in the candlelight. She wore no rings, except the slender circlet of gold that had been put on her finger at the altar 6 years ago. Conversation at dinner proceeded slowly, but on pleasant lines. Edith seemed preoccupied, and, at times, Alden relapsed into long silences. Madame noted that they scarcely spoke to each other, and was vaguely troubled, for she liked Edith, and wanted Alden to like her, too. After dinner, Edith played cribbage with Madame, and Alden read the paper. When Madame had won 3 games, in rapid succession, Edith said good night. Alden, from the depths of his paper, murmured the conventional response. That night he started from his sleep with a sense of foreboding. He sat up and listened, but there was no sound. Not even the wind moving a shutter, nor a swaying branch tapping at his window, Not a footfall, nor an echo, nor a breath. The tall clock on the landing struck 4. The silvery strokes died away into a silence that was positive rather than negative. The sense of foreboding still persisted. Moreover, he was conscious that someone else was awake also. Was it his mother? Was she ill? No, he was sure of that. Was it Edith? Yes, that was it. She was awake, and had been awake all night. Moreover, she was crying. His heart throbbed with tender pity. He yearned to comfort her, to assure her that whatever was wrong must eventually be made right. Why, from the crown of her beautiful head to the turned up toe of her blue Chinese slipper, Edith had been made for joy and for love. Out of the darkness came a sudden mysterious perception. She knew she had awakened him, and had smiled at the knowledge. A sense of weariness quickly followed, then a restful silence which carried no thought with it. He lay back on his pillow and waited, with his eyes closed, until he felt that she was asleep. Then he slept also. End of chapter 9. Chapter 10 of Master of the Vineyard by Myrtle Reed. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. A Little Brown Mouse. Rosemary peered into the letter box and saw that the household guardian was there. On one Thursday it had failed to appear, and she had been unable to convince Grandmother of her entire innocence in the matter. Even on the following day, when she brought it home, in the original wrapping, she felt herself regarded with secret suspicion. As it never had failed to come on Thursday, why should it, unless Rosemary, for some reason best known to herself, had tampered with the United States mail? There was also a letter, and Rosemary waited eagerly for the postmaster to finish weighing out 2 pounds of brown sugar and 5 cents' worth of tea for old Mrs. Sims. She pressed her nose to the glass and squinted, but the address eluded her. Still, she was sure it was for her, and, very probably, from Alden, whom she had not seen for 10 days. She felt a crushing sense of disappointment when she saw that it was not from Alden, but it was addressed in an unfamiliar hand. Regardless of the deference she was accustomed to accord a letter, she tore it open hastily and read: My dear Rosemary, can you come to tea on Saturday afternoon about 4? We have a guest whom I am sure you would like to meet. Affectionately, Your Mother. The words were formal enough, and the quaint stateliness of the handwriting conveyed its own message of reserve and distance, but the signature thrilled her through and through. Mother, she repeated in a whisper. She went out of the post office blindly, with the precious missive tightly clasped in her trembling hand. Would she go? Of course she would, even though it meant facing Grandmother, Aunt Matilda, and all the dogs of war. As the first impulse faded, she became more cautious, and began to consider ways and means. It was obviously impossible to wear brown gingham or brown alpaca to a tea party. That meant that she must somehow get her old white muslin down from the attic, iron it, mend it, and freshen it up as best she could. She had no doubt of her ability to do it, for both old ladies were sound sleepers, and Rosemary had learned to step lightly, in bare feet, upon secret errands around the house at night. But how could she hope to escape unobserved on Saturday afternoon? And even if she managed to get away, what of the inevitable return? Why not, for once, make a bold declaration of independence, and say, calmly: Grandmother, I'm going to Mrs. Marsh's Saturday afternoon at 4, and I'm going to wear my white dress. Not, may I go? Or, may I wear it? But I am going, and I am going to wear it. At the thought Rosemary shuddered, and her soul quailed within her. She knew that she would never dare to do it. At the critical moment her courage would fail her, and she would stay at home. Perhaps she could wear the brown gingham if it were fresh and clean, and she pinned at her throat a bow of the faded pink ribbon she had found in her mother's trunk in the attic. And, if it should happen to rain Saturday, or even look like rain, so much the better. Anyhow, she would go, even in the brown gingham. So much she decided upon. Yet, with all her heart, she longed for the white dress, the only thing she had which even approached daintiness. An old saying came back to her, in which she had found consolation many times before. When an insurmountable obstacle presents itself, sometimes there is a way around it. And again, take one step forward whenever there is a foothold, and trust to God for the next. That night, at supper, Aunt Matilda electrified Grandmother with a bit of news which she had jealously kept to herself all day. "The milkman was telling me," she remarked, with an assumed carelessness which deceived no one, "that there's company up to Marsh's." Grandmother dropped her knife and fork with a sharp clatter. "You don't tell me!" she cried. "Who in creation is it?" "I was minded to tell you before," Aunt Matilda resumed, with tantalizing deliberation, "but you've had your nose in that fool paper all day, and whenever I spoke to you, you told me not to interrupt. Literary folks is terrible afraid of bein' interrupted, I've heard, so I let you alone." "I didn't know it was anything important," murmured Grandmother, apologetically. "How could you know," questioned Matilda, logically, "before I'd told you what it was?" There being no ready answer to this, Grandmother responded with a snort, which meant much or little, as one might choose. A dull red burned on her withered cheeks, and she had lost interest in her supper. Only Rosemary was calm. "As I was sayin'," Matilda went on, after an aggravating silence, "there's company up to Marsh's." "Seems to me," Grandmother grunted, "that she'd be better payin' up the calls she owes in the neighbourhood than entertainin' strangers." This shaft pierced a vulnerable spot in Matilda's armour of self esteem, for she still smarted under Madame Marsh's neglect. "The milkman says it's a woman. Her name's Mis' Lee. She come a week ago, and last Saturday she was to the post office, and up the river road all the afternoon in that old phaeton with young Marsh." Rosemary's heart paused for a moment, then resumed its beat. "She's a play actin' person, he says, or at any rate she looks like one, which amounts to the same thing. She's brought 4 trunks with her. One respectable trunk, same as anybody might have, one big square trunk that looks like a dog house, and another big trunk that a person could move into if there wasn't no other house handy, and another trunk that was packed so full that it had bulged out on all sides but one, and when Jim and Dick took it up into the attic there wasn't but one side they could set it on. And whiles they was findin' a place to set it, she and young Marsh was laughin' down in the hall." "Who is she?" demanded Grandmother. "Where did she come from? How long is she goin' to stay? Where'd Mis' Marsh get to know her?" "The milkman's wife was over last Monday," Matilda continued, "to help with the washin', and she says she never see such clothes in all her born days, nor so many of 'em. They was mostly lace, and she had 2 white petticoats in the wash. The stocking was all silk, and she said she never see such nightgowns. They was fine enough for best summer dresses, and all lace, and one of 'em had a blue satin bow on it, and what was the strangest of all was that there wa'n't no place to get into 'em. They was made just like stockin's with no feet to 'em, and if she wore 'em she'd have to crawl in, either at the bottom or the top. She said she never see the beat of those nightgowns." "Do tell!" ejaculated Grandmother. "And her hair looks as if she ain't never combed it since the day she was born. The milkman says it looks about like a hen's nest and is pretty much the same colour. He see her on the porch for a minute, and all he could look at was that hair. And when he passed 'em on the river road, after they come from the post office, he couldn't see her hair at all, 'cause she had on a big hat tied on with some thin light blue stuff. He reckoned maybe her hair was a wig. I'd know whether 'twas a wig or not if I saw it once," Grandmother muttered. "There ain't nobody that can fool me about false hair." "I guess you ain't likely to see it," retorted Matilda, viciously. "All we'll ever hear about her'll be from the milk folks." "Maybe I could see her," ventured Rosemary, cautiously. "I could put on my best white dress and go see Mrs. Marsh, to morrow or next day, after I get the work done up. I could find out who she was and all about her, and come back and tell you." For an instant the stillness was intense, then both women turned to her. "You?" they said scornfully in the same breath. "Yes," said Grandmother, after an impressive pause, "I reckon you'll be puttin' on your best dress and goin' up to Marsh's to see a play actin' woman." "You'd have lots to do," continued Aunt Matilda, "goin' to see a woman what ain't seen fit to return a call your aunt made on her more'n 5 years ago." "Humph!" Grandmother snorted. "The very idea!" exclaimed Aunt Matilda. What had seemed to Rosemary like an open path had merely led to an insurmountable stone wall. She shrugged her shoulders good humouredly. "Very well," she said. "I'm sure I don't care. Suit yourselves." She began to clear away the supper dishes, for though the others had eaten little, they had apparently finished. Out in the kitchen, she sang as she worked, and only a close observer would have detected a tremor in the sweet, untrained soprano. "Anyway," thought Rosemary, "I'll put on the flat irons." The fire she had built would not go out for some hours. She had used coal ruinously in order to heat the oven for a special sort of tea biscuit of which Grandmother was very fond. While the fire was going out it would heat the irons, and then "One step forward whenever there is a foothold," she said to herself, "and trust to God for the next." That night, as fortune would have it, Grandmother and Aunt Matilda elected to sit up late, solving a puzzle in the Household Guardian for which a mission rocker was offered as a prize. It was long past 10 o'clock when they gave it up. "I dunno," yawned Aunt Matilda, "as I'm partial to rockers. Leastways," continued Grandmother, rising to put her spectacles on the mantel, "to the kind they give missionaries. I've seen the things they send missionaries more'n once in my time." By 11 the household slept, except Rosemary. As silently as a ghost, she made her way to the attic, brought down the clean white muslin, and, with irons scarcely hot enough, pressed it into some semblance of freshness. She hung it in her closet under the brown alpaca of 2 seasons past, and went to sleep peacefully. Bright and early the next morning the idea presented itself. Why not put on the white gown with one of the brown ones over it, and take off the brown one when she got there? Mrs. Marsh would understand. Rosemary laughed happily as she climbed out of bed. Surely there was more than one way of cheating fate. That afternoon, while the others took their accustomed 40 winks, she brought down the faded pink ribbon that had been her mother's. That night she discovered that neither of the brown ginghams would go over the white muslin, as they had shrunk when they were washed, but that the alpaca would. There was not even a bit of white showing beneath the skirt, as she had discovered by tilting her mirror perilously forward. She was up early Saturday morning, and baked and swept and dusted to such good purpose that, by 3 o'clock, there was nothing more that anyone could think of for her to do until it was time to get supper. She had put the white gown on under the alpaca when she dressed in the morning, as it was the only opportunity of which she was at all sure. Grandmother and Aunt Matilda were nodding in their chairs. The kitchen clock struck the half hour. Finally Rosemary spoke. "Is there anything either of you would like me to get at the store?" "No," said Grandmother. "No," echoed Aunt Matilda. Then she added, "Why, were you thinkin' of goin' out?" "I thought I would," said Rosemary, with a yawn, "if there was nothing more for me to do. It's such a nice day, and I'd like a breath of fresh air." For a moment fate hung in the balance, then Grandmother said, generously, "Go on, Rosemary, and get all the fresh air you want. You've worked better'n common to day." "I should think you'd be tired enough to stay home and rest," Aunt Matilda commented, fretfully, but the door had closed on the last word, and Rosemary was gone. But April's sun strikes down the glades to day, so shut your eyes upturned, and feel my kiss creep as the spring now thrills through every spray, up your warm throat to your warm lips. The beautiful words sang themselves through her memory as she sped on. She had forgotten about the guest for the moment, remembering with joy that almost hurt, the one word "mother," and the greater probable joy that overshadowed it. Of course he would be there. Why not, when he knew she was coming to tea, and when they had a guest, too? The girl's heart beat tumultuously as she neared the house, for through it, in great tides, surged fear and ecstasy and love. Madame herself opened the door. "Come in, dear." "Oh, Mrs. Marsh, please, just a minute." "Mrs. Marsh again? I thought we were mother and daughter. Edith," she called. Then, in the next moment, Rosemary found herself in the living room offering a rough, red hand to an exquisite creature who seemed a blurred mass of pale green and burnished gold, redolent of violets, and who murmured, in a beautifully modulated contralto, "How do you do, Miss Starr? I am very glad to meet you." The consciousness of the white gown underneath filled Rosemary's eyes with tears of mortification, which Madame hastened to explain. "It's raw and cold still," she said, "in spite of the calendar. These keen spring winds make one's eyes water. Here, my dear, have a cup of tea." Rosemary took the cup with her hands that trembled, and while she sipped, the amber fragrance of it struggled hard for self-possession. Madame ignored her for the moment and chatted pleasantly with Edith. Then Alden came in and shook hands kindly with Rosemary, though he had been secretly annoyed when he learned she was coming. Afterward, he had a bad quarter of an hour with himself while he endeavoured to find out why. At last he had shifted the blame to Edith, deciding that she would think Rosemary awkward and countrified, and that it would not be pleasant for him to stand by and see it. However, the most carping critic could have found no fault with Edith's manner. If she felt any superiority, she did not show it. She accorded to Rosemary the same perfect courtesy she showed Madame, and apparently failed to notice that the girl had not spoken since the moment of introduction. She confined the conversation wholly to things Rosemary must have been familiar with: the country, the cool winds that sometimes came when one thought it was almost summer, the perfect blend of Madame's tea, the quaint Chinese pot, and the bad manners of the canary, who seemed to take a fiendish delight in scattering the seed that was given him to eat. Rosemary merely sat in the corner, tried to smile, and said as required, "Yes" or "No." Alden, pitying her from the depths of his heart and yet secretly ashamed, tried unsuccessfully, now and then, to draw her into the conversation. Edith drained her cup, affected disappointment at finding no stray leaves by which she might divine the future, then went to Rosemary and took the empty cup which she sat holding with pathetic awkwardness. "You have none either, Miss Starr," she said sweetly. "Suppose we try the crystal ball. I've been wanting to do it ever since I came, but was afraid to venture alone." Rosemary, her senses whirling, followed her over to the table, where the ball lay on its bit of black velvet. "How do you do it?" asked Edith of Madame. "Just get into a good light, shade your eyes, and look in." "That's easy," Edith said. She bent over the table, shaded her eyes with her white, beautifully kept hands, and peered into the crystalline depths. "There's nothing here," she continued somewhat fretfully, to Alden, "except you. By some trick of reflection, I could see you as plainly as though it were a mirror. You try, Miss Starr." Madame's heart contracted suddenly as she remembered the day she had looked into the crystal ball, and had seen not only Alden, but a woman with flaming red hair clasped closely in his arms. "It's all nonsense," she tried to say, but her stiff lips would not move. Rosemary left the table and went back to her corner. "What did you see?" queried Edith. "Did you have any better luck than I did?" "No," Rosemary answered, with a degree more of self-possession than she had shown previously. "There was nothing there but a black cloud." The task of keeping up the conversation fell to Edith and Alden, for Madame had unconsciously withdrawn into herself as some small animals shut themselves into their shells. All were relieved, though insensibly, when Rosemary said she must go. Alden went into the hall with her, to help her with her coat and hat, and, as opportunity offered, to kiss her twice, shyly, on her cheek. He wanted to go part way home with her, but Rosemary refused. "You'd better not," she said, "but thank you just as much." "Won't you even let me go to the corner with you?" "No," said Rosemary, with trembling lips. "Please don't." So she went on alone, while Alden returned to the living room. Edith was saying to Madame, "Poor little brown mouse, how one longs to take a girl like that and give her all the pretty things she needs." Madame took the crystal ball, wrapped it in its bit of velvet, and put it on the highest shelf of the bookcase, rolling it back behind the books, out of sight. "Why do you do that, Mother?" asked Alden, curiously. "Because," returned Madame, grimly, "it's all nonsense. I won't have it around any more." Alden laughed, but Edith went on thoughtfully. "I'd like to do her hair for her, and see that all her underthings were right, and then put her into a crêpe gown of dull blue, a sort of Chinese blue, with a great deal of deep toned lace for trimming, and give her a topaz pendant set in dull silver, and a big picture hat of ecru net, with a good deal of the lace on it, and one long plume, a little lighter than the gown." "I would, too," said Alden, smiling at Edith. He did not in the least know what she was talking about, but he knew that she felt kindly toward Rosemary, and was grateful for it. Rosemary, at home, went about her duties mechanically. There was a far away look in her eyes which did not escape the notice of Grandmother and Aunt Matilda, but they forbore to comment upon it as long as she performed her tasks acceptably. At supper she ate very little, and that little was as dust and ashes in her mouth. Before her, continually, was a heart-breaking contrast. She, awkward, ugly, ill at ease in brown alpaca made according to the fashion of 10 or 15 years ago, and Mrs. Lee, beautiful, exquisite, dainty to her finger tips, richly dowered with every conceivable thing that she herself lacked. "Mother," said Rosemary to herself, "oh, Mother!" She did not mean Mrs. Marsh, but the pretty, girlish mother who had died in giving birth to her. She would have been like Mrs. Lee, or prettier, and she would have understood. Her heart smarted and burned and ached, but she got through the evening somehow, and at the appointed time stumbled up to her own room. Why should she care because another woman was prettier than she, knew more, and had more? Were there not many such in the world, and had she not Alden? Accidentally, Rosemary came upon the cause of her pain. Of course she had Alden, for always, unless then, once more, reassurance came. "She's married," said Rosemary, smiling back at the white, frightened face she saw in the mirror. "She's married." The thought carried with it so much comfort that presently Rosemary slept peacefully, exhausted as she was by the stress of the afternoon. "She's married," was her last conscious thought, and a smile lingered upon her lips as she slept. She had not enough worldly wisdom to know that, other things being equal, a married woman may be a dangerous rival, having the unholy charm of the unattainable, and the sanction of another man's choice. End of Chapter 10. Chapter 11 of Master of the Vineyard by Myrtle Reed. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The hour of the turning night. The darkness was vibrant, keen, alive. It throbbed with consciousness, with mysterious fibres of communication. There was no sense of a presence in the room, nor even the possibility of a presence. It was vague, abstract, yet curiously definite. Edith woke from a troubled dream with a start. For a moment she lay quietly and listened, not afraid, but interested, as though upon the threshold of some new experience. The scurrying feet of mice made a ghostly patter in the attic above her room, and a vagrant wind, in passing, tapped at her window with the fairy-like fingers of the vine that clung to the wall. Otherwise all was still, and yet the darkness trembled with expectancy. Something hitherto unknown seemed to have entered her consciousness, some thought, emotion, instinct, or what? Wide awake, staring into space, she lay there, wondering, waiting, not in the least frightened, but assured of shelter and of peace. Gradually she had lost consciousness of her body. She had relaxed completely and her mind soared, free. She moved one foot, cautiously, to see whether her body was still there, and smiled when she was reassured by the cool smoothness of the linen sheet, and the other warm little foot she touched in moving. Somewhere in this same darkness was another personality. Of so much she eventually became sure. It was not in the room, perhaps not even in the house, but for someone else, somewhere, was this same sense of communication? No, but rather the possibility of it. Someone else had also lost consciousness of the body. Another mind, released for the moment from its earthly prison, sought communion with hers. Was this death, and had she awakened in another world? She moved her foot again, pressed her hand to the warm softness of her breast, felt her breath come and go, and even the steady beating of her heart. Not death, then, only a pause, in which for once the body, clamorous and imperious with its thousand needs, had given way to the soul. The curious sense of another personality persisted. Was this other person dead, and striving mutely for expression? No, surely not, for this other mind was on the same plane as hers, subject to the same conditions. Not disembodied entirely, but only relaxed, as she was, this other personality had wakened and found itself gloriously free. A perception of fineness followed. Not everyone was capable of this, and the conviction brought a pleasant sense of superiority. Above the sordid world, in some higher realm of space and thought, they two had met, and saluted one another. For the first time Edith thought of her body as something separate from herself, and in the light of a necessary, or unnecessary, evil. This new self neither hungered nor thirsted nor grew weary. It knew neither cold, nor heat, nor illness. Pain, like a fourth dimension, was out of its comprehension. It required neither clothes nor means of transportation. It simply went, as the wind might, by its own power, when and where it chose. Whose mind was it? Was it someone she knew, or someone she was yet to meet? And in what bodily semblance did it dwell, when it was housed in its prison? Was it a woman or a man? Not a woman. Edith instantly dismissed the idea, for this sense of another personality carried with it not the feeling of duality or likeness, but of difference, of divine completion. Some man she knew, or whom she was to know, freed for the moment from his earthly environment, roamed celestial ways with her. She was certain that it was not lasting, that, at the best, it could be of very brief duration, and this fact of impermanence was the very essence of its charm, like life itself. The clock downstairs began to strike. 1, 2, 3, 4. It was the hour of the night when life is at its lowest, the point on the flaming arc of human existence where it touches the shadow of the unknown, softening into death or brightening into life according to the swing of the pendulum. Then, if ever, the mind and body would be apart, Edith thought, for when the physical forces sink, the spirit must rise to keep the balance true. Who was the man? Her husband? No, for they were too far apart to meet like this. She idly went over the list of her men acquaintances. Old schoolmates, friends of her husband's, husbands of her friends, as one might call the roll of an assembly, expecting someone to rise and answer, "Here." Yet it was all in vain, though she felt herself on the right track and approaching a definite solution. The darkness clung about her like a living thing. It throbbed as the air may when a wireless instrument answers another, leagues away. It was as eloquent of communication as a network of telephone and telegraph wires, submerged in midnight, yet laden with portent of life and death. She sat up in bed, straining every nerve to the point where all senses unite in one. "Who are you?" Her lips did not move, but the thought seemed to have the sound of thunder in its imperious demand. Tangled fibres of communication noiselessly wove themselves through the darkness, and again all her soul merged itself into one question. Who? For God's sake, who? Then, after a tense instant of waiting, the answer flashed upon her, vivid as lightning. Alden Marsh. And swiftly, as though in response to a call, a definite, conscious thought from the other personality presented itself. "Yes? What would you have of me?" Edith lay back among her pillows as the clock struck the half hour. The body, as though resentful of denial, urged itself swiftly upon her now. Her heart beat tumultuously, her hands shook, she thrilled from head to foot with actual physical pain. The darkness no longer seemed alive, but negative and dead, holding somewhere in its merciful depths the promise of rest. Utterly exhausted, she closed her eyes and slept, to be roused by a tap at the door. "Yes," she answered drowsily. "Come in." Madame came in, pulled up the shades and flooded the room with sunshine. "I'm sorry if I've disturbed you, dear. but I was afraid you were ill. I've been here twice before." Edith sat up and rubbed her eyes. "What time is it?" "9:30. "Oh, I'm so sorry. You mustn't spoil me this way, for I do want to get up to breakfast. Why didn't you call me?" Madame sat down on the side of the bed, and patted Edith's outstretched hand with affectionate reassurance. "You're to do just as you please," she said, "but I was beginning to worry a bit, for you've been the soul of punctuality. Did" Edith closed her lips firmly upon the instinctive question "did he miss me?" She dismissed it as the mere vapouring of a vacant brain. "Did what?" asked Madame helpfully. "Did you miss me?" "Of course. Alden did too. The last thing he said before he went to school was that he hoped you were not ill." "That was nice of him." Edith put a small pink foot out of bed on the other side and gazed at it pensively. Madame laughed. "I don't believe you've grown up," she said. "You remind me of a small child who has just discovered her toes. Do you want your breakfast up here?" "No, I'll come down. Give me half an hour and I'll appear before you clothed and in my right mind, with as humble an apology for my sins as I'm able to compose in the meantime." She was as good as her word, appearing promptly at the time she had set, and dressed for the street. After doing justice to a hearty breakfast, she said that she was going out for a walk, and probably would not be back to luncheon. "My dear," exclaimed Madame, "you mustn't do that. I'll have luncheon kept for you." "No, please don't, for I really shan't want any. Didn't you observe my breakfast? Even a piano mover couldn't think of eating again before 7, so let me go a gypsying till sunset." Madame nodded troubled acquiescence, and, with a laugh, Edith kissed her good bye. "I'm subject to the wanderlust," she said, "and when the call comes, I have to go. It's in my blood to day. So farewell for the present." Madame watched her as she went down the street, the golden quill on her green hat bidding jaunty defiance to the wind. As she had said, she felt the call at times, and had to yield to its imperative summons, but to day it was her soul that craved the solace of the open spaces and the wind swept fields. As she dressed, she had tried to dismiss last night's experience as a mere fantasy of sleep, or, if not an actual dream, some vision hailing from the borderland of consciousness, at the point where the senses merge. Yet, even as she argued with herself, she felt the utter futility of it, and knew her denials were vain in the face of truth. She dreaded the necessity of meeting Alden again, then made a wry face at her own foolishness. "Ridiculous," she said to herself, "preposterous, absurd." No matter what her own nightmares might be, he slept soundly. Of course he did. How could healthy youth with a clear conscience do otherwise? For an hour or more she kept to the streets of the village, with the sublime unconsciousness of the city bred, too absorbed in her own thoughts to know that she was stared at and freely commented upon by those to whom a stranger was a source of excitement. Her tailored gown, of dark green broadcloth, the severe linen shirtwaist, and her simple hat were subjects of conversation that night in more than one humble home, fading into insignificance only before her radiant hair. The general opinion was that it must be a wig, or the untoward results of some experiment with hair dye, probably the latter, for, as the postmaster's wife said, "Nobody would buy a wig of that colour." The school bell rang for dismissal and filled her with sudden panic. After walking through the village all the morning to escape luncheon with Alden, it would be disagreeable to meet him face to face almost at the schoolhouse door. Turning in the opposite direction, she walked swiftly until she came to a hill, upon which an irregular path straggled half-heartedly upward. So Edith climbed the Hill of the Muses, pausing several times to rest. When she reached the top, she was agreeably surprised to find a comfortable seat waiting her, even though it was only a log rolled back against two trees. She sank back into the hollow, leaned against the supporting oak, and wiped her flushed face. Others had been there before her, evidently, for the turf was worn around the log, and there were even hints of footprints here and there. Some rural trysting place, probably, she thought, then a gleam of scarlet caught her attention. A small red book had fallen into the crevice between the log and the other tree. "The House of Life," she murmured under her breath. "Now, who in this little village would, unless—" The book bore neither name nor initials, but almost every page was marked. As it happened, most of them were favourite passages of her own. "How idyllic," she mused. "A pair of young lovers reading Rossetti on a hilltop in spring. Could anything be more pastoral? I'll take it back to the house and tell about it at dinner." She welcomed it as a sure relief from a possible awkward moment. "I knew I was right," she said to herself, as she turned the pages. "To day was set aside long ago for me to go a gypsying." The clear air of the heights and the sunlit valley beneath her gave her a sense of proportion and of value which she realised she had sadly needed. Free from the annoyances of her daily life, she could look back upon it with due perspective, and see that her unhappiness had been largely caused by herself. "I can't be miserable," she thought, "unless I'm willing to be." She sat there for a long time, heedless of the passing hours. She was roused from her reverie by a muffled footstep, and an involuntary exclamation of astonishment. "Why, how do you do, Miss Starr?" said Edith, kindly, offering a well gloved hand. "Are you out gypsying, too?" "Yes," Rosemary stammered. Her eyes were fixed upon the small red book that Mrs. Lee held in her other hand. "See what I found," Edith went on, heedlessly. "Rossetti's House of Life up here. Boy Blue must have brought it up to read to Bo Peep in the intervals of shepherding. There may not be any such word as shepherding, but there ought to be. I love to make words, don't you?" "Yes," said Rosemary, helplessly. She had thought Alden had the book, but had forgotten to make sure, and now the most precious hours of her life had been invaded and her shrines laid bare. Was it not enough for this woman to live in the same house with Alden? Need she take possession of the Hill of the Muses and the little book which had first awakened her, then brought them together? Resentful anger burned in her cheeks, all the more pitiful because of Mrs. Lee's utter unconsciousness, and the impossibility of reparation, even had she known. "Sit down," Edith suggested. "You must be tired. It's a long climb." Did you come up here to meet anyone?" The suspicion broke hotly from Rosemary's pale lips. Edith might have replied that she came up to avoid meeting anyone, but she only said, with cool astonishment: "Why, no. Why should I?" There was no answer to that. Indeed, thought Rosemary, floundering helplessly in a sea of pain, there was no reason. Was she not in the same house with him, day in and day out? "She's married," Rosemary said to herself with stern insistence, trying to find comfort in the thought, but comfort strangely failed now. Another suspicion assailed her and was instantly put into headlong speech. "Is your husband dead, or are you divorced?" Mrs. Lee turned quickly. She surveyed the girl calmly for an instant, entirely unable to translate her evident confusion. Then she rose. "Neither," she returned, icily. "And if there are no other personal questions you desire to ask me, I'll go back." Rosemary kept back the tears until Mrs. Lee was out of sight. "She's married," she sobbed, "and he isn't dead, and they're not divorced. So why oh, why?" The pain unreasonably persisted, taking to itself a fresh hold. She had offended Mrs. Lee, and she would tell Alden, and Alden would be displeased and would never forgive her. If she were to run after her and apologize, assuring her that she had not meant the slightest offence, perhaps She stumbled to her feet, but even as she did so, she knew that it was too late. She longed with all the passion of her desolate soul for Alden's arms around her, for only the touch of his hand or the sound of his voice saying, "Rosemary, Rosemary, dear." But it was too late for that also. Everything came too late. By the time she reached the foot of the hill Edith had understood and pardoned Rosemary. "Poor child," she thought. "Think of her loving him, and actually being jealous of me. And, manlike, of course, he's never noticed it. For her sake I hope he won't." She waited to gather a spray or two of wild crab apple blossoms, then went home. She did not see Alden, but stopped to exchange a few words with Madame, then went on upstairs. The long walk had wearied her, but it had also made her more lovely. After an hour of rest and a cool shower, she was ready to dress for dinner. She chose a dinner gown of white embroidered chiffon that she had not yet worn. It was cut away a little at the throat and the sleeves came to the elbow. She was not in the mood for jewels, but she clasped a string of pearls around her perfect throat, and put the crab apple blossoms in her hair. The experiment was rather daring, but wholly successful, as she took care to have green leaves between the hair and the blossoms. When she went down, Madame and Alden were waiting for her, Alden in evening clothes as usual, and Madame in her lavender gown. "You look like a nymph of Botticelli's," commented Alden, with a smile. There was no trace of confusion or even of consciousness in his manner, and once again Edith reproached herself for her foolishness. Dinner was cheerful, though not lively. Once or twice Edith caught Alden looking at her with a strange expression on his face. Madame chattered on happily, of the vineyard and the garden and the small household affairs that occupied her attention. Afterward, Alden read the paper and the other two played cribbage. It was only a little after 9 when Madame, concealing a yawn, announced that she was tired and would go to bed, if she might be excused. Edith rose with alacrity. "I'll come too," she said. "It's astonishing how sleepy it makes one to be outdoors." "Don't," Madame protested. "We mustn't leave him entirely alone. You can sleep late to morrow morning if you choose." "Please don't leave me alone, Mrs. Lee," pleaded Alden, rather wickedly. "All right," Edith answered, accepting the inevitable as gracefully as she might. "Shall I play solitaire while you read the paper?" "If you like," he replied. Madame took her candle and bade them good night. As she went upstairs, Edith said, with a pout, "I wish I were going to bed, too." "You can't sleep all the time," he reminded her. The paper had slipped to the floor. "Mother tells me that you slept this morning until 9:30." "Yes, but " She bit her lips and the colour rose to her temples. She hastily shuffled the cards and began to play solitaire so rapidly that he wondered whether she knew what cards she was playing. "But," he said, "you didn't sleep well last night. Was that what you were going to say?" Edith dropped her cards and looked him straight in the face. "I slept perfectly," she lied. "Didn't you?" "I slept just as well as you did," he answered. She thought she detected a shade of double meaning in his tone. "I had a long walk to day," she went on, "and it made me sleepy. Look," she continued, going to the mantel where she had left the book. "See what I found on top of a hill, in a crevice between an oak and a log that lay against it. Do you think some pair of rural lovers left it there?" "Possibly," he replied. If the sight of the book he had loaned Rosemary awoke any emotion, or even a memory, he did not show it. "Sit down," he suggested, imperturbably, "and let me see if I can't find a sonnet that fits you." "Yes, surely. Here it is. Listen." She rested her head upon her hand and turned her face away from him. In his smooth, well modulated voice, he read: Her gifts. High grace, the dower of queens, and therewithal some wood-born wonder's sweet simplicity. A glance like water brimming with the sky, or hyacinth light where forest shadows fall, such thrilling pallor of cheek as doth enthrall the heart, a mouth whose passionate forms imply all music and all silence held thereby. Deep golden locks, her sovereign coronal, a round reared neck, meet column of love's shrine to cling to when the heart takes sanctuary. Hands which forever at love's bidding be, and soft stirred feet still answering to his sign. These are her gifts, as tongue may tell them o'er. Breathe low her name, my soul, for that means more. Her heart beat wildly and her colour came and went, but with difficulty she controlled herself until he reached the end. When she rose, he rose also, dropping the book. "Mrs. Lee, Edith." "Yes," she said, with a supreme effort at self-command. "It is a pretty name, isn't it?" She was very pale, but she offered him her hand. "I really must go now," she continued, "for I am tired. Thank you, and good night." Alden did not answer, in words. He took the hand she offered him, held it firmly in his own, stooped, and kissed the hollow of her elbow, just below the sleeve. CHAPter 12.